The Capitol chamber in Austin was electric with tension. Governor Greg Abbott had called for a special legislative hearing to defend Texas's controversial abortion restrictions, confident in the strength of the arguments he and his legal team had prepared. With cameras rolling and the public watching live, Abbott sat at the head of a panel surrounded by his advisors, prepared for another day of political theater. But this time, Representative Jasmine Crockett was on the docket to speak. Known for her sharp tongue and fearless questioning, Crockett had arrived early. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and clutching a thick binder of documents, she glanced around the room with calm intensity. Her team behind her whispered final notes, but she barely needed them. This wasn't just another debate for Crockett, it was personal. Her district had been overwhelmed with horror stories since the law passed: underage victims forced into silence, women denied life-saving care, doctors afraid to act. At 9:03 a.m., her name was called. The room went silent as she approached the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, voice steady. "Let's talk about what this law actually does, not what you claim it does." Greg Abbott shifted slightly in his seat. This wasn't going to be a routine defense. And everyone knew it. Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone, flipping open her binder with surgical precision. "I'd like to begin with a case from San Antonio. A 15-year-old rape victim was denied access to abortion services due to delays caused by your law's reporting requirements. By the time the paperwork cleared, she was 17 weeks along, and forced to leave the state for care." She looked up, straight at Governor Abbott. "Is that what you meant by pro-life?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Abbott gave a measured smile, leaning into his mic. "We believe every life is sacred, Representative Crockett. And we also provide support for mothers," she cut in, crisp and controlled. "Respectfully, Governor, your support includes no paid maternity leave, no guaranteed childcare, and some of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country, particularly for Black women." The room tightened. Abbott's team exchanged glances, one whispering in his ear. But Crockett wasn't done. "Let's also talk about House Bill 1280, your so-called trigger law. It bans abortions even in cases of fatal fetal anomalies. You expect women to carry pregnancies they know will end in tragedy." She reached into her binder and pulled out a printed email, a real testimony from a grieving mother in Dallas. She wrote, "I begged my doctors for help. They told me they'd go to jail if they did. I had to wait until my baby's heartbeat stopped on its own. I'll never forget the sound of silence." The gallery was quiet now. Even the most seasoned politicians sat still. Abbott cleared his throat, his rehearsed replies faltering. Crockett's eyes narrowed. "And you call that justice?" Governor Abbott leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a composed but visibly strained gesture. "Our laws are in full alignment with the Constitution after the Dobbs decision. The states have the right to protect unborn life," he said, reaching for solid ground. Crockett didn't flinch. "With respect, Governor, your interpretation cherry-picks precedent while ignoring real-time constitutional harm, specifically the denial of equal protection under the law," she replied. She pointed behind her, where a large screen flickered on, displaying a map of abortion access across the U.S. In Texas, a woman in a medical emergency must either flee the state or wait until her life is on the brink. In New York, she gets immediate care. That's not equal treatment under federal law, that's geographic discrimination. A Republican senator on the panel tried to interject, "That's an emotional argument, not a legal one." Crockett turned to him calmly. "Then let's go legal." She held up a stack of papers, amicus briefs filed by constitutional scholars from Harvard, Yale, and the University of Texas itself. "These experts, from both sides of the aisle, agree your law is dangerously vague, medically uninformed, and legally unstable. So while you're talking about states' rights, you're ignoring the federal rights you're actively stripping from women." Abbott shifted again, this time reaching for a bottle of water. A camera zoomed in as he uncapped it with a subtle tremble. Crockett continued. "This isn't about values anymore. It's about legal liability. You're opening this state up to a wave of lawsuits. And every single one will bear your signature. The silence in the room was deafening. Jasmine Crockett paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Her words had landed, not just on Abbott, but across the entire chamber. Even conservative members of the panel glanced at one another, sensing the shift in the room. Then she stepped forward. I want to tell you what this looks like outside these marble walls, not in courtrooms, not in policy memos, but in hospitals, shelters, and homes where families are breaking under the weight of this law. She reached into her folder again and unfolded a handwritten letter. This is from a nurse in Lubbock. She wrote, I watched a woman miscarry in agony because the fetus still had a faint heartbeat. We couldn't touch her. We stood by and waited for her infection to worsen before we were allowed to save her life. She nearly died. Her husband held her hand and sobbed. She folded the paper slowly. This is the human cost of your legislation, Governor. You call it pro-life. But your laws treat living, breathing women as afterthoughts. Abbott didn't respond. He blinked and looked down at his notes. Jasmine went on, her voice gaining weight. You said the law protects the most vulnerable. But who are you really protecting? The unborn, or the political donors and lobbyists who see women's bodies as battlegrounds? A few gasps sounded quietly in the chamber. You want to legislate morality, she said. Then let's be honest about what that means. Because morality without compassion is just cruelty in a suit. Abbott opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett raised her hand gently. I'm not done. She stepped to the side, activating another slide on the monitor, a chart showing the spike in out-of-state abortion travel, the increase in black market pills, and the rise in unsafe procedures performed in secrecy. This is what happens when you force silence. When you replace doctors with politicians. When you turn pain into policy. She turned back to him, her tone solemn now. And when the next woman dies because a doctor was afraid to act, will you still smile in front of cameras and call it a victory? Abbott looked back at her, but this time, there was no smug retort. No political pivot. Just a long, brittle pause. Crockett stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat without another word. The audience, stunned into stillness, began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing force. The hearing was far from over. But something had changed. Greg Abbott was no longer in control of the room. The applause didn't last long, the room wasn't that kind of place. But the echo of Jasmine Crockett's final line seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any speech that came before it. The chair of the panel called for order, and eyes turned back to Governor Abbott, who adjusted his tie, shuffled his notes, and leaned into the microphone. He cleared his throat once, twice, then looked up. Representative Crockett raises deeply emotional concerns, he began. And while I respect the intensity of her position, we must not let anecdotal evidence distract us from the core values of this state. There it was, the pivot. But it felt thinner than before. He continued, slower now. Texas has always stood for the sanctity of life. We believe in defending the unborn. The people of Texas elected us to uphold that principle. Crockett didn't move. She just watched him, cool, silent, waiting. Abbott scanned the room, searching for a lifeline. We've also increased funding for adoption services and maternal care, a voice cut in. Which you slashed in 2021 before reinstating under national pressure, Crockett said, not even raising her hand. The chamber stilled again. Abbott looked momentarily thrown but tried to recover. Yes, and we've since restored those programs, to a fraction of what they were. And only after public backlash. She was crisp, calm. Don't rewrite the record, Governor. We all lived through it. For a beat, Abbott just sat there, mouth slightly open, unable to summon the usual parade of talking points. The panel chair leaned forward. Let the governor finish, Representative. Crockett raised a single brow but nodded. She knew she'd already done the damage. Abbott tried once more. Every state has the right to determine its own moral course. That's what the Supreme Court has affirmed. Texas chose life. But Texas didn't choose life, Crockett countered. It chose control. The panel chair banged the gavel this time. Representative Crockett, she held up a hand and spoke into the microphone, slowly. No more euphemisms. No more pretending that this law isn't about punishing poor women, marginalized women, and survivors of violence. If this was about life, you'd be standing here with a fully funded healthcare system and universal child care. But you're not. Abbott's face had hardened into something unreadable. But it was clear, he wasn't going to try again. He knew any rebuttal would only pour gasoline on Crockett's fire. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. Silent. And for a man who rarely let silence win, it said more than any of his speeches ever could. Crockett closed her binder and folded her hands. The battle, for now, was over. But the war over Texas's future was only beginning. The moment Jasmine Crockett left her seat, the chamber erupted, not with applause this time, but with a surge of movement, reporters whispering into phones, aides scrambling with notepads, and committee members exchanging frantic glances. The atmosphere had shifted from political theater to political reckoning. Governor Greg Abbott remained seated, his expression tightly composed, but it was clear the damage was done. He looked over at his legal counsel, who subtly shook his head. There was no elegant way to counter what had just unfolded, not without looking colder, more disconnected, or more dishonest than ever before. Outside the chamber, the hallway was already swelling with journalists. Microphones pointed like weapons. Cameramen adjusted their lenses. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett Clash and hashtag Abbott Expose began trending before she even reached the rotunda. But Jasmine didn't stop for questions, not yet. She walked calmly to the steps of the Capitol, the June sun casting a fierce glow behind her. With the Texas flag flapping overhead and a growing crowd gathering at the base of the steps, she turned to face them. I didn't speak up today because I enjoy fighting with the governor, she said, her voice amplified by the cluster of media mics. I spoke up because Texans are tired of suffering in silence, tired of leaders who legislate pain and call it virtue. Cameras flashed. Texas has become a testing ground for extremism. A place where fear guides policy more than facts. Where a woman's trauma is debated like a campaign slogan. And I won't stand for that. Cheers broke out from the crowd below. People who had been watching the live stream from phones and tablets were now arriving in person, some with signs, some with tears, some just to say they had witnessed something real. Back inside, Abbott's senior staff huddled in a tight knot, whispering about messaging recovery. What do we say? One aide asked nervously. This is going viral, it's already everywhere. Another aide looked at their phone and winced. She quoted the Constitution and backed it with real data. If we attack her, we'll look desperate. Abbott didn't answer. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked briskly toward the back exit, away from the press pool entirely. It wasn't just a bad hearing. It was a political blow. A televised defeat at the hands of a woman who didn't blink once. Hours later, news networks looped clips of the hearing non-stop. Analysts praised Crockett's composure, legal precision, and raw emotion. Headlines read, Jasmine Crockett dismantles Abbott's abortion defense in real time, from law to life. Crockett humanizes the policy debate, Governor Abbott sidelined by his own silence. Social media turned Jasmine's final line, if this was about life, you'd be standing here with a fully funded healthcare system, into a rallying cry. By the end of the day, her speech had over 12 million views across platforms. Young women, activists, lawyers, even former skeptics, were reposting it with captions like, "This is leadership." And as the sun set over Austin, one thing had become crystal clear, this wasn't just a win in a hearing room. It was a seismic moment in the fight over women's rights in Texas. And Jasmine Crockett had just lit the fuse. Within 24 hours of the hearing, Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of the Texas abortion law defenses wasn't just a state story, it was a national one. CNN ran the headline, "Texas Democrat Jasmine Crockett stuns Greg Abbott and the nation." MSNBC had her on primetime that night. Fox News, scrambling, labeled her performance radical activism disguised as advocacy, though even some conservative commentators admitted Abbott had looked visibly unprepared. But beyond the pundit panels and political spin, something else had begun to stir: momentum. In states like Florida, Georgia, and Missouri, where copycat laws had begun to take shape, organizers saw Crockett's takedown as fuel. Clips of her speech were edited into rally videos. Activists printed her quotes on signs and T-shirts. Law students in New York and California began citing her hearing transcript in papers. One even called it the new gold standard for confronting legislative overreach. Meanwhile, in Texas, Abbott's office tried to regain footing. A press release referred to Crockett's testimony as theatrics, but internal polling told a different story. Approval among women under 40 had dropped 5 points overnight. Even more troubling for his administration, some moderate Republicans in the state legislature began distancing themselves from the law's harshest provisions. A few called for clarity and medical exceptions reform. Behind closed doors, donors raised concerns about the optics, particularly after Crockett's testimony revealed just how unprepared the governor had been for real scrutiny. At the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. When asked by reporters whether she planned to launch a statewide campaign or seek higher office, she smiled and replied, "I didn't give that speech to climb. I gave it because someone had to speak the truth, without fear, without spin, and without waiting for permission." But privately, even some of her closest aides were buzzing. "She didn't just win the hearing," one whispered over lunch. "She may have just changed the political calculus in this state." Indeed, political strategists across both parties were now redoing their 2026 maps. For the first time in years, some believed Texas might not be a Republican stronghold forever. And at the heart of that storm stood Jasmine Crockett, poised, principled, and entirely unafraid. Weeks passed, but the shockwaves from that Capitol hearing hadn't faded, they'd only grown louder. Town halls across Texas filled with women sharing personal stories they had once been too afraid to speak aloud. Doctors testified in growing numbers, some risking their careers to speak out about the harm the law had caused. Faith leaders, too, began to split, some doubling down on the current stance, others echoing Crockett's words about compassion, not control. A movement was forming, not built on rage, but on clarity. And at its center, Jasmine Crockett remained unswerving. She returned to her district in Dallas to find sidewalks covered in chalk messages. "Thank you, Rep. Crockett. We believe you. Lead us forward." People lined up outside her office, not for favors, but for purpose. Nurses, single mothers, college students, ministers. Some brought flowers. Others brought campaign volunteer forms. One woman, middle-aged and soft-spoken, waited an hour just to hand her a letter. "I lost a daughter under this law," she said through tears. "You made her story matter. You gave it a name." Behind the scenes, the Democratic Party began quietly shifting gears. Leadership meetings now included her name in serious conversations about statewide positions, even Senate runs. Fundraising emails mentioning her hearing performance broke donation records. But Crockett, ever strategic, wasn't rushing. She'd seen politicians get drunk on momentum and burn out. She focused instead on writing new legislation, a bill ensuring emergency protections for pregnant women whose lives were in danger. It didn't pass the first time. But it didn't need to. What mattered was that it was now part of the conversation, and the press couldn't look away. On a brisk morning in early autumn, she returned to the Capitol steps where it all began. This time, surrounded by women from across the state, patients, doctors, lawyers, and students. She stood with them in unity, not as a symbol, but as a servant of the people. "I stood in that hearing room because Texas deserved a voice that didn't flinch," she told the crowd. "We've been told to sit down and be quiet for too long. But we're not going back. We're going forward, together." And with that, Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the podium, not into silence, but into a storm of cheers. History would remember that hearing as a flashpoint, a moment when the tide began to turn. And the woman who lit that spark? She was just getting started. While Jasmine Crockett's words were still echoing through streets, screens, and statehouses, something quieter, but just as consequential, was happening in the shadows of power. Inside the governor's mansion, the mood had shifted from damage control to deep concern. Senior staff had gathered late into the night following the now infamous hearing. The television was on mute, but it played endless loops of Crockett's testimony. Every advisor had a notepad. Some had folders filled with polling data, others with legal memos. All of them were nervous. "She changed the narrative," one aide said bluntly. "And we let her do it live." Greg Abbott, seated at the head of a long table, didn't respond immediately. He stared at the screen, not with anger, but with calculation. "She didn't just challenge the law," another staffer added, flipping through a binder. "She questioned our legitimacy. And for the first time, it worked." Silence. Then Abbott finally spoke. "Start vetting challengers. Grassroots. Media. Legal. If she's going national, we need to box her in before she decides to run statewide." The room nodded, the order clear: contain the threat. But it wasn't that simple anymore. Elsewhere, in Washington, D.C., a quiet meeting was unfolding at the DNC headquarters. Jasmine Crockett's name had landed on a shortlist, not as a curiosity, but as a candidate. Senatorial material. Possibly gubernatorial. Possibly more. "She has the instincts of a trial lawyer and the presence of a stateswoman," one strategist said. "And she speaks like someone who's lived what she fights for." "She didn't blink against Abbott," another added. "That kind of poise under pressure. You can't teach that." But Jasmine herself, back in Texas, was ignoring the speculation. When asked about national office, she kept her answer consistent: "I'm focused on protecting Texans, not positioning myself." Still, her schedule told another story. Meetings with reproductive justice groups. Closed-door sessions with constitutional law scholars. Strategy calls with advocacy leaders from battleground states. Crockett wasn't chasing attention, but she wasn't running from the opportunity either. In private, her team had already begun to draft a roadmap, not just to challenge Texas law, but to redefine it. To build a movement grounded in law, lived experience, and unapologetic truth. And one night, as she looked over a handwritten list of names, doctors, survivors, nurses, teenage girls who had written to thank her, Jasmine said quietly, "They tried to silence them with policy. But now those voices are the resistance." The movement was no longer just about a bill. Or a hearing. Or a clash. It was the start of something larger. And for the first time in years, the power in Texas felt like it was shifting, not by decree, but by determination. Months had passed since that pivotal hearing, but the reverberations were still felt deep within Texas and beyond. Jasmine Crockett's defiant stand had ignited a movement, one that was no longer just about abortion laws but about reclaiming agency, dignity, and justice for millions. The Texas legislature convened for the next session under unprecedented pressure. Media outlets tracked every word, every vote. The public was more engaged than ever before, flooding town halls, emails, and phone lines with urgent calls for reform. Jasmine, now a recognized voice of resilience and leadership, introduced a comprehensive bill, the Women's Protection and Health Act, aimed at ensuring safe access to reproductive care, funding maternal health programs, and protecting doctors from legal retaliation when saving lives. Her bill faced fierce opposition, but the tides were turning. Moderate legislators, swayed by the groundswell of public support and Crockett's unyielding advocacy, pledged their votes. Grassroots campaigns mobilized statewide, and national organizations funneled resources into Texas like never before. Governor Abbott, once so confident, now faced mounting criticism from his own party. His attempts to double down on restrictive policies met resistance even among longtime allies. At a packed rally in downtown Dallas, Crockett addressed thousands of supporters, her voice strong and unwavering. "We are more than legislation," she declared. "We are mothers, daughters, sisters, survivors. We are the heartbeat of Texas. And together, we will build a future where no woman is left to suffer in silence." Her words rang out against the evening sky, carrying the promise of change. The battle was far from over, but the narrative had shifted irrevocably. Where once silence reigned, now there was song. Where once fear governed, now stood courage. Jasmine Crockett had not only challenged a law, she had challenged the very soul of Texas politics, and in doing so, opened the door to a new chapter of hope and justice.